Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time Samuel visited Spain and Portugal after returning from his last trip to Philadelphia. While his visit was relatively uneventful, he did recount his experiences with some interesting characters he met along the way. From there, Samuel sailed to Ireland, and then to Liverpool, where we find him now. About the month of August, the brig Mayflower, that I was first master of, returned from Lisbon to Liverpool with a cargo of cotton. The master that left England with her was put into prison at Lisbon with some other British shipmasters who in a drunken frolic shot a Portuguese boatman. As I was not to leave Liverpool for Quebec till the spring of the year 1793, I was requested to superintend the Mayflower and the delivery of her cargo, a great part of which was wetted with salt water, the vessel being 37 years old and very leaky. When the vessel had discharged her cargo, I was asked whether I had any objection to make a voyage to Bristol. I replied in the negative, as I much disliked an idle life. I was therefore again appointed master of this brig, and having obtained a cargo of rock salt, etc., sailed for Bristol. But having to carry a press of sail in rough weather to keep off the shore in Balmerus Bay, the vessel became very leaky, so that after my arrival in Bristol I was requested to apply to two of her owners in that city to consult what was best to be done with her. At last it was determined to sheathe her bottom. About this time, the Bank of England stopped discounting bills, being aware of the great extent of false credit in the kingdom, the consequences of which are well known by the multitude of bankruptcies that took place in the year 1793. Liverpool was especially affected by the storm, so that business for a while lay dormant, and a vast many houses were shut up. Having got the brig sheathed, I sailed for Liverpool, but had a very disagreeable passage, the vessel still being leaky. Whilst lying at Bristol, I witnessed a curious scene, viz. A merchant had stopped payment, and when this was known to his creditors, without resorting to law, the tradesmen boarded one of his vessels, ready to sail for the West Indies, and seized on the property that originally belonged to them. And what was more surprising, the captain assisted in the delivery, for I saw him attending the hatchway to bear off the goods hoisted up by the tradesmen, and I had the curiosity to stay a while at the vessel, and saw a half of a new cable that had been spliced to an old one by a rope maker being cut off on board. When the French War broke out, Mr. 1010 was all agog for privateering, which by no means met my approbation, as I considered it in no other light but a kind of licensed robbery, or as a plunderage of peaceable and innocent individuals. The Brothers, having been built as an armed ship, had all her ports ready, and 26 guns were now put on board her as a privateer. The John had bulwarks raised on her, and was fitted out as a letter of marque. My new mate, whom I shipped before I sailed again for Bristol, was one of the surviving crew of His Majesty's ship Guardian, whose bottom was beat to pieces against the ice in the Southern Ocean, but still floated to save the people who remained by the vessel. The brothers' privateer soon sent in 2 prizes, but they provided what seamen termed Flemish. One was a Swede, which I believe was soon liberated. The other a Dane with a French cargo for the West Indies, remained for the decision of the Court of Admiralty, but was finally liberated, leaving a loss to the owners of the privateer for some thousands. The officers of the brothers had wantonly tortured the Dane's captain by means of a thumbscrew, in hopes he would confess what nation owned his cargo, but they failed of obtaining the desired information, leaving the owners of their ship open to the penalties of law incurred by their bad conduct. I was not at all pleased that no other vessel was provided for me, but my hopes being kept alive by fair promises, I procured a cargo and sailed for Bristol about May 1793, and arrived there safe after a middling passage. After the brig was discharged, I was determined to pay a visit to my friends in the West. It was the latter end of May when I left Bristol in a stagecoach for Exeter. The weather being excessively hot greatly reduced the pleasure of traveling, and I am not a little surprised that the English should make use of the same carriages for public conveyance both in extreme cold and intense heat, and is truly lamentable to be boxed up during a long summer day in a close coach, and especially in the one that conveys the mail. Other nations with less genius provide different carriages to suit the different seasons. The following day being the Sabbath, no coach went out to the westward, but on Monday morning at 6 o'clock I left Exeter, well pleased with my entertainment, and set off for the west. Among the rest of my fellow passengers were a London tailor and his son. The father was going into Cornwall for orders. We had not proceeded many miles when the son became sick, and emptied his stomach partly on my clothes. But as there was no help for the accident, I endeavored to make the best of it, but not without lecturing the landsman for his neglect of running his head through the porthole of the coach. We breakfasted at Oakhampton, and I was not a little pleased in partaking of some clotted cream once more. We dined at Launceston, and in the evening arrived at Bodmin. The next morning early I proceeded on my route, and on our arrival at Indian Queen, a single house on a common, I quitted the coach, as I expected to find my brother-in-law's horse awaiting my arrival to convey me across the country. By the time I had taken my breakfast in a damp, musty room, the horse appeared. We crossed a very rough country, and arrived at Grampound about noon, where I was cordially received by my friends and relations. After staying here a few days, I departed for the extremity of Cornwall, with an intention of spending a few weeks at my native place, with an uncle and his married nieces, with one of whom he resided, the wife of a surgeon. My brother-in-law lent me a horse and accompanied me a few miles towards Truro. On entering this town, I found it much improved since I visited it when a boy, it being now well lighted and paved at the sides for foot passengers with flagstones. I passed on to Redruth, where I dined, seeing some pickled samphire on the table brought old times to my recollection, as I had been accustomed to range over the cliffs when a youth where this plant grew. Having left Redruth, I had a pleasant ride, often in sight of the sea, and arrived safe in my native town, receiving a hearty welcome from my friends and townsmen. My friend the surgeon, who is now my host, had been my playmate in childhood. He was possessed of an excellent garden and summer house delightfully situated for overlooking the pier, bay, and pilchard fishery. In this garden I took great delight, and was not a little chagrined and mortified at receiving a letter a few days after my arrival here to hasten my return to Bristol, as my friend had agreed for my vessel to load a cargo of horse beans immediately for Liverpool. As I was engaged to dine with H.M. Praed, Esquire, the patron of the borough, at his country residence, I went there at the time fixed, but found myself so unwell that I could eat little dinner, though the table was plentifully loaded with roast and boiled butcher's meat, poultry, venison, potted liver, pastry, etc. And he being a man of great opulence, possessing extensive gardens with hothouses, etc., I need not say the dessert abounded with varieties. After a few glasses of wine were drank, the company retired to the bowling green, where I remained a looker-on. This commanded a view of the beautiful park well stocked with deer, some of which were browsing while others were reclining in peace under the branches of wide-spreading trees, with which the park was well stored. It also contained ponds of water in which doubtless there were many fishes, as they appeared well laid out at a great expense for that purpose. We had our tea in the bowling green house. About the latter end of June, I commenced my journey for Bristol. My host accompanied me as far as Camborne, where we took our tea and parted. Soon after I left Redruth, night came on, when a gentleman joined me and proposed continuing in company till our arrival at Truro, which I was glad of, being a stranger on this road. Soon afterwards, a third horseman joined us, and being acquainted with my companion, they entered into conversation, and as my horse was small and unable to keep pace with the others, I was soon left in the rear to find my way alone in a very dark night. The highway being skirted with tin mines and gravel pits rendered my travel unpleasant, and I was not a little pleased when I arrived at the turnpike gate at the entrance of the town. After supping at the inn, for want of room I was conducted to a bedroom in a private house, which appeared to have been occupied lately by an army officer, whose breastplate and other apparatus lay in disorder on the toilet. The next day, after breakfast, I was standing at the inn door awaiting the arrival of the Falmouth stage, when I saw the landlord reconnoitering the movements of a person whom I found was his female servant, and who had saved a little money, but that now she was repairing to the church to be united to a married soldier, knowing him to be such, then under marching orders. At length the coach arrived without a single vacancy, but as several men were waiting for places, I agreed with two gentlemen to proceed in a post-chaise to Exeter, and therefore immediately preceded the stage. After journeying a few miles, I found that one of my companions was a London wine merchant, and the other a clergyman, who informed me that he was also a chaplain to an illustrious personage. But had he been dressed in another garb, his manners and conversation would have led me to suppose that he was a man of a very different character. We traveled the following night, in hopes to save the Bristol coach from Exeter, but during the last stage we began to despond, as the chaise moved slowly, and we could not prevail on the postboy to drive quick. However, we were not a little pleased at seeing the stagecoach at the door as we approached the inn door at Exeter. We dismissed our driver without his usual fee, as he had used impertinent language. At 6 o'clock my companions mounted the top of the coach to enjoy a view of the country, but being far from well, I preferred an inside berth to avoid the direct rays of the sun. The only passenger I found in the carriage was a girl about 14, returning to a boarding school at Taunton, and from her hair and complexion was doubtless a native of India. She conducted the conversation with a reserve not usual with young ladies of her age, but was not at all deficient in politeness. At breakfast, without solicitation, she took the management of the repast, and appeared no more embarrassed than if she had been used to the superintendence of the table for many years. I once traveled with a young lady that had just quitted school, of a very different behavior, which was doubtless the effect of an improper education. We found the weather very hot, and I heard that a number of horses had been killed in the stages during the past month from the great heat. On our arrival at Bristol, at 7 in the evening, I repaired to the quay and found my vessel in great forwardness for sailing. The steerage had been broken open at night by a rogue who carried off some clothes. This man was known to make use of a boat on the tide, in which he carried off his prey unmolested. One day an American ship hauled alongside my vessel, and as the tide ebbed, she leaned heavy against our topside, doing much injury. I therefore called a survey to enable me to recover damages, when to my great surprise I discovered that the top timbers, or ribs of our vessel, had disappeared, being long since returned to dust. There being now nothing to fasten the planks to, a few chocks were fixed, and I was determined, if I got safe to Liverpool, to abandon this bundle of boards forever, she not being seaworthy and her condition highly dangerous. As soon as we cleared customs, I proceeded with the brig to Pill, to be ready for the first fair wind. 2 or 3 of my crew were Swedes, which were in general secure from the Empress, and always considered so by the Admiralty. But while I was at Bristol, the gang boarded the brig and carried off the foreign seamen, knowing them to be such. As soon as I heard of my loss, I applied to the 2 lieutenants for their release in vain. I then made a humble application to the regulating captain, who heard me with indifference, and finally dismissed the petition. I was therefore under the necessity of hunting for other men. After much trouble, I met with a landsman who agreed to go with me if I would permit him to take his Welsh wife to Liverpool, having been married about 3 weeks. To this I consented, not knowing where to get another man. I advanced him a little money to buy tea, sugar, etc., and got them on board. But in a night or 2 after, the man absconded, leaving his spouse as a legacy to me. On inquiry, I found she was so extremely ill-tempered and quarreled so often with her husband that he thought best to leave her without a change of clothes. I therefore ordered her to leave the vessel, contrary to her inclination. I now removed my brig to Morgan's Pill, and was visited by Captain Duckett, commander of a privateer in King's Road, who insisted on my company to dine at Lamplighters Hall, with the noted privateer Captain John Shaw, who formerly commanded the Lion from Bristol, but cannot say I was highly entertained with the conversation, it being in a style I much disliked. At last the wind moderated, and having got under sail, we reached the flat Holmes by low water, and anchored under the lee of that island before night, and proceeded as far up the North Channel as the Scary Light, when an easterly wind forced us to run for Holyhead, where we anchored. We lay here a few days, during which a Parkgate packet and a Liverpool pilot boat were forced into the harbor. I went on shore to this poor place, and in hopes to find some entertainment, I visited the hotel, and do not think I saw a single person belonging to the house, nor a newspaper, and as no one would answer my requirements, I left it as I found it, not very clean. The people here make use of oatmeal cakes, but the principal inhabitants draw their provisions from Dublin, and I have seen loaves of bread landing from the packets. After our arrival at Liverpool, I declined sailing again in the vessel, which was finally sold to a Portuguese. After I had remained a few weeks unemployed, I felt like a fish out of water, restless. I was in the habit of spending my evenings at my lodgings, a boarding house for shipmasters. One night a boy came running into the house saying that our host was at the West Country Coffee House, where 2 men were beating him. His son-in-law, a shipmaster, and myself ran immediately to the public house. On the road, knowing my companion to be a violent young man, I cautioned him against involving himself in trouble till he knew the cause of the affray. But he bounced into the room with the greatest impetuosity, and seeing two men in their shirts, he seized hold of one of them and began to buffet him. The other, being his companion, ran to his assistance against the intruder, which brought me into contact also, our host having left the room previous to our arrival. One of the stripped boxers now struck me, and having seized him by the collar, we both fell on the sanded floor, which prevented firm footing. My antagonist now got his fingers inside my mouth and endeavored to disfigure my face, making 3 furrows in my cheek. As several people and a watchman had now entered the room, we were separated. On inquiry, I found the man who had wounded me was a blockmaker, a noted boxer, and the other was his journeyman. But what was the reason of the original quarrel with my host was not worth my notice, as I knew him to be a tippler. A few minutes before, I had been peaceably in my dwelling, prudent in advice and an enemy to tippling. But notwithstanding this from the folly of a rash young man, I was now wounded, bleeding, and disgraced in an alehouse. My face the next day was decorated with 3 black plasters as an emblem of a rioter. I was ashamed for some days to appear in public, and the scars on my face remain to this day. After being about 3 months idle, I was unexpectedly put into full employ. A letter arrived from the mate of the Thetis tender, dated Sheerness, saying that her master had gone into the hospital at Plymouth, sick, and the mate had requested that Mr. 1010 would send him money to purchase clothes, that he might appear respectable in his new situation as master. As my relation was now in Liverpool, Mr. 1010 wished him to go to the vessel, but I imagine he did not like being in a fighting ship. Having collected a few clothes in my trunk, I set off per coach, and was 2 nights and a day in getting to London, where I arrived with a sore throat. Having dispatched my business, I took coach at noon the next day for Chatham. My fellow travelers were of various characters and descriptions. One was a lieutenant of Marines, returning unsuccessful from the recruiting service. Another was a Highland sergeant who had been on the Dunkirk expedition. There was also a farmer and 2 talkative women of the lower class. The lieutenant had little to recommend him but vulgarity, which he seemed to delight in as his natural element, and in the course of conversation I found he was a ci devant guinea pig from an East India ship. The sergeant was a well-informed, sensible man, and gave me a farther account of the expedition to Flanders than I had seen in the newspapers. I was landed at Sheerness dockyard, and went on board my vessel, and though the decks had been recently washed, the footmarks thereon certified what I was to expect below. I found the lieutenant, a man apparently verging on dotage, with a heavy head, who gave himself no trouble about the state of the vessel, being arrived at that age in which the grasshopper is a burden. I perceived he was much afflicted with asthma, and seldom left the ship, being fond of peace and quietness. After he had conversed a while, he informed me that he feared I was to come too late to mend a bad business, as he had every reason to expect that the ship would be dismissed the service. I found the mate, who had written for money to buy fine clothes, a slothful drunkard, with his hands well covered with the itch, and fearing to catch this musical disease, I sent him to the Union Hospital ship for cure. Both the ship's crew and lieutenant's boat's crew, properly denominated the press gang, were short of their number, and many of those on board I perceived towards evening were drunk on their allowance of beer, especially the boatswain on his watch, who was not capable to give me an answer, though he appeared to walk steadily. I soon reduced those gentlemen to sobriety by reducing their allowance, and got the vessel brushed up to appear a little after the rate of what she was expected to be. One of the midshipmen was a rough, tippling, vulgar seaman, the other a pert, conceited, ci devant attorney's clerk. The latter gentleman soon gave me an opportunity of curbing his impudence. He had stayed beyond his time on shore, which I reproved him for. He replied that I had no authority to call him to an account, as my appointment originated with the merchants, but that he was a regular naval officer. I reported the conversation to the lieutenant, who replied I had equal authority and rank with sailing masters of men of war in the 6th rate, and if I required it, he would order one of the midshipmen's legs to be put in irons, and he would then be tried by a court-martial and broke. The midshipman was now ordered to attend the tribunal of the commanding officer, and was informed of his liability to punishment, and as I wanted nothing more than his humility, I forgave him. One of the apprentices ran from the boat, and another had deserted before my arrival. I was well assured that they were on board one of the armed ships, and one of them was discovered on board a brig. On going on board her, I found both the lads were there, and I demanded them of the lieutenant, who was not willing to give them up. But on application to the admiral, I soon obtained their release, and to prevent their desertion in the future, I kept them on board and locked them in the press room at night. The old lieutenant read much in his Bible, and I believe often went through the service in the liturgy of the establishment, but at other times I could perceive he was far from being a pious man. As I was now the purser, he expected me to find him in several articles of food, etc. As he was not an epicure requiring dainties, I indulged him in his little wants, and having offered to bring forward his accounts for him, he was highly pleased, and we agreed like Darby and Joan. On my arrival, I had inquired about the sails, and was informed they were in the hands of a sailmaker at Queensborough. When the new sails came on board, I took the trouble to inspect and measure the new canvas over, and found an overcharge of about 57 yards of cloth, and therefore took liberty to cut off 14 pounds from his bill, which he would not allow. I therefore withheld the payment. One day in the dockyard, a drunken gunner abused me sadly as a rogue and a cheat for not paying his friend, the sailmaker. After being here several weeks, orders arrived to prepare for paying off the crew, as the ship was to quit the service. When the stores were delivered, the admiral's yacht came alongside early in the morning, and all but the mate, who was left as shipkeeper, quitted our ship, and the pendant was hauled down. The lieutenant left his old Bible as a legacy to me. The midshipmen and cutter's crew, being king's men, were turned over to the men of war. I now collected my little crew, about 5 or 6 in number, and proceeded to the packet-house to wait for the evening's tide to return to the ship. My men having now money, I need not say that I was fully employed all afternoon in keeping them together. Towards evening, I got the drunkards into the passage boat. My mate had contrived to get some Geneva on board, and I found him to be a mere beast in drunkenness, but as quiet as a mouse, laying about the deck like one dead, except in the appearance of his eyes, which were lively. We were now ready for sailing, but could not attempt it for want of men. I was therefore determined to apply to the admiral to lend me some to conduct the ship to London, and accordingly I obtained an order for a midshipman and 2 seamen out of an armed ship. The midshipman went on shore to Sheerness and absconded, so I had only 2 in addition. A master of an armed ship invited me on board here, and I was not a little surprised at the appearance of the cabin, which was decorated with the implements of war. Even the ceiling was crowded with rockets, false fires, etc., and as much spirit was used in this floating dwelling, it was rather astonishing that it did not operate at some nocturnal hour in exploding this collection of fireworks. The garrison and dockyards at Sheerness appeared to stand on made ground in an eligible situation for commanding the entrance of the river Medway. The side of the yard next to the water is planked and caulked to keep out the tide. As there were few houses for sheltering the great number of men employed in the yard, 2 or 3 old ships of the line were hauled upon the beach, and there propped upright to receive them and their families. Many little tenements were also erected on their upper decks. Returning from the shore one day on going down into the cabin, I observed the deck on fire near the stove chimney. Had it not been discovered in daylight, the ship might have been burnt during the night, as I had little watch kept by the drunkards. Having obtained a pilot for London, we got under sail. As we drew near Lee Road, the Comet brig fired a shot across us and brought us to. Her launch with sails soon boarded us under the command of our late midshipman, the ci devant attorney's clerk, who had a grudge against my best apprentice, they having quarreled in Chatham Yard. And notwithstanding I had an admiralty protection and 2 men lent me by the admiral to help me to London, this vile chap took away the lad in the boat, and I never saw him after. My mate was laying about near the forecastle, speechless with drink, which now reduced my crew to the same number they were before I borrowed the men. During our run up the Thames, my men were obliged to lift the mate from place to place out of harm's way, as he was like a dead man. This was the gentleman that wanted money to buy fine clothes to appear in his new situation as master. We got to Rotherhithe before dark and moored there. Near Griffin's Wharf was a public house frequented chiefly by Western country men. There I went occasionally to meet townsmen and old acquaintances. Here I met my father's tailor, who made my clothes when a boy, and as he was carrying on his business in the borough, I gave him an order. I also met a Turkish captain, who had accumulated large property since I sailed with him when he was second mate of the Lisbon packet, his father being at the same time the boatswain. Here I saw an idle, dissipated clergyman with a colored pair of breeches on, which he had received in charity from the captain. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ascalon. Amongst the rest of my old acquaintances, I recognized the phiz of T.E., the packet's mate, who often treated me with great brutality. I made myself known to him, and being now able to speak with the enemies in the gate, I soon discovered that his crest had fallen, and that he now bore the badge of sycophant. A number of masters of vessels of my acquaintance, at the adjoining wharves, belonged to a society known by the appellation of Old Fellows. As the fee of admission was only 13 pence, I was indulged, from curiosity, to become a member, and was accordingly proposed and admitted, when I found it to be merely a bacchanalian club, under professed rules of morality, the members being masked during the ceremony of admitting a new brother. The last time I saw the lieutenant was at a porterhouse near his lodgings. I found him solitary in a public company, and when I accosted him, his sight being dim, he knew me not. But after I seated myself near him, he discovered his late shipmate. He, still being desirous of employ, was afterwards stationed at a telegraph, where he died, and I was informed had amassed a fortune of about 10,000 pounds. Whilst with me he appeared an object of charity, being very bare of necessary clothing. His uniform, hat, and coat appeared old friends, and as he was fond of ceremony, the former had performed as much service as a Frenchman's chapeau de bras. His poor cockade had been long like himself, drooping its wings. When he put on a neck handkerchief to attend orders from the admiral, I observed that it was unhemmed, and I imagine it had formerly been a piece of a shirt. The only pair of hose that I had ever seen he wore daily. They were a coarse pair of speckled stockings, which I was informed he had drawn from the slops, value of 2 shillings 3 pennies, professedly for his servant, but actually for himself. I never saw his valet, and should have been ignorant of his having one, had I not heard that he always happened to be on shore on a muster day. On passing a bookseller's in the Strand, I saw a volume in the window relative to the loss of the Antelope, East India packet, on the Pellew Islands. This brought to my recollection that I had been solicited at Falmouth to take a situation in this ship, the voyage on which she was lost, and being curious to know how I should have been treated, I purchased the book, and still keep it as a memento of the kindness of Providence to one of the unworthiest of its servants. On the last day of our loading, we were taking on board bobbins of flour, and, after having given the necessary instructions, I left the ship to prepare my business for leaving London. I did not return till 8 o'clock at night, and on entering the ship I perceived the main hatchway open with the flour piled irregularly therein, higher than the deck. I could find no person to answer me, and on entering the cabin found the doors open, but no light there. As I was groping in the dark, I kicked something with my foot, and on examining it farther, I found it was my log of a mate, again in a state of "How came ye so?" Had the river depredators been aware of our situation, they would doubtless have visited the ship and carried off a great part of the cargo. If a person wishes to know what trouble and anxiety means, he may find an index to it during war in the countenance of a careful, conscientious shipmaster. I hope you enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description to find out more ways that you can support this project and others. And tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.